Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the value of your savings, your country's currency, and the entire global financial system had been pegged to a decision made decades ago in a quiet New Hampshire hotel. A decision you never voted for, never heard debated, and probably never questioned. A decision that, despite its age, still shapes wages, wars, markets, and the hidden flows of wealth across continents. And yet, very few people understand what actually happened at Bretton Woods, why the world agreed to it, or how it quietly locked nearly every nation into dependence on the US dollar. The real story is stranger, more political, and more strategically engineered than the reassuring version found in textbooks. Because behind the polished narrative of global cooperation lies something far more consequential. A trap disguised as stability. The mystery begins not with the end of World War II, as many assume, but with a problem that had haunted global finance for centuries: trust. Nations had never agreed on a reliable system for valuing their currencies relative to one another. Gold standards collapsed, paper money regimes dissolved, and trade wars erupted not because countries wanted chaos, but because they lacked a common anchor they could all believe in. Bretton Woods promised that anchor. But it also quietly handed one country a level of financial power no empire in history had ever enjoyed. The puzzle, then, is not why Bretton Woods rose. It's why the rest of the world accepted, not temporarily, but permanently, a system that left them dependent on American decisions. That is the question this story unravels. To understand how we arrived there, we must first return to the early 20th century, when global finance was a contest of clashing systems. Before the dollar reigned, the British pound sat at the center of world trade, backed by empire and gold. But by the 1930s, Britain's finances were strained, its empire weakening, and its currency shaken by the economic earthquake of the Great Depression. Meanwhile, the United States had emerged from both world wars as the world's industrial giant, with unmatched gold reserves and productive capacity. But dominance alone wasn't enough to guarantee monetary leadership. The world needed rules, it needed stability, and the US needed a way to convert its economic strength into lasting global influence. This is where the first twist appears. Bretton Woods wasn't simply about cooperation, it was about competition between two men with rival visions: John Maynard Keynes of Britain and Harry Dexter White of the United States. Keynes imagined a balanced international system with a neutral global currency called the Bancor, designed to prevent any single nation from gaining too much power. White proposed something very different, a dollar-centered system in which other nations tied their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself was convertible into gold. White's plan, not Keynes's, became the foundation of Bretton Woods. But what's rarely mentioned is that White's design effectively made global trade dependent on US monetary policy. It solved a crisis of international trust, but replaced it with a new dependency on the dollar. With the stage set, the Bretton Woods Conference convened in 1944 at the Mount Washington Hotel. 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered to negotiate the post-war financial order. But despite the diversity of nations present, the outcome was shaped overwhelmingly by the economic reality of the time. The United States held the majority of the world's gold. The world needed American loans, American production, and American stability. And so, even before the conference began, the system was tilted toward American interests. Under the agreement, currencies would be fixed to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to provide financial support and reconstruction funding. On paper, the arrangement promised stability. In practice, it quietly placed the United States at the center of global finance for one simple reason: every nation now needed dollars to trade. This is where the story becomes a chain of unintended consequences, because if the world needed dollars to function, the United States had to supply them. But how could the US spread dollars across the globe without losing gold? How could it maintain confidence in the dollar's convertibility while simultaneously running deficits to provide liquidity for global trade? Economists later gave this dilemma a name: the Triffin paradox. But in 1944, the seeds of the problem went unnoticed. The world celebrated the promise of stability, unaware that a flaw in the system guaranteed its eventual collapse. As the post-war decades unfolded, Bretton Woods appeared to work. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized, trade expanded, and American dollars flowed everywhere. Through the Marshall Plan, military spending, corporate expansion, and booming global demand. But below the surface, the math no longer added up. By the 1960s, the US had far more dollars circulating abroad than gold in its vaults. Confidence faltered. Nations began redeeming dollars for gold, draining American reserves. The United States faced a choice: cut dollar supply and risk global recession, or maintain dollar supply and risk losing its gold anchor. The breaking point came in 1971. With gold reserves falling and foreign governments lining up for redemptions, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The move was intended as temporary, but the gold window never reopened. Bretton Woods was dead, and yet the dollar survived. In fact, it didn't just survive, it became even more dominant. Here lies the paradox that puzzles historians and economists alike. If Bretton Woods ended in 1971, why is the world still locked into a dollar-centric system? Why didn't global finance fragment? Why didn't countries adopt their own anchors or return to gold? The answer is the second, deeper trap. The post-Bretton Woods order didn't replace the dollar. It entrenched it. Once the gold link broke, the dollar gained something no currency had ever possessed: the ability to expand without constraint. Nations still needed dollars for oil, trade, and debt. Markets still used dollars as their benchmark. And the absence of convertibility meant that the US no longer had to defend the dollar with gold. What was supposed to weaken American power ended up strengthening it. But this brings us to the next phase of the story: the fallout. As the gold anchor vanished, the world entered a new era of floating exchange rates, petrodollar recycling, global financialization, and exploding sovereign debt. The US struck agreements with Saudi Arabia to price oil exclusively in dollars, ensuring that energy, the lifeblood of modern economies, could be purchased only with American currency. This pushed global demand for dollars even higher, giving the US unprecedented financial leverage. Meanwhile, developing nations became trapped in cycles of dollar-denominated borrowing, vulnerable to American interest rates they couldn't control. And rich nations, from Japan to Europe, found themselves accumulating massive reserves of dollars to stabilize their currencies in the new floating rate world. These were not the outcomes envisioned at Bretton Woods. They were the consequences of a system held together not by gold or rules, but by habit, inertia, and the structural dominance of the American financial empire. And yet, the most surprising twist is this: even though countries have tried repeatedly to build alternatives, from the euro to Asian monetary blocs to the BRICS currency proposals, none has broken the dollar's grip. The reasons are complex, but they all connect back to the architecture created in 1944. Bretton Woods was designed to stabilize the world. In doing so, it made the dollar unavoidable, and that unavoidable dependency has become the defining feature of global finance today. But to understand why the world has failed to escape this system, we need to follow the timeline further and examine the attempts to build new monetary frameworks. The crises that expose the vulnerabilities of dollar dependence and the modern parallels that reveal how the same patterns of imbalanced power and unintended consequences continue repeating themselves. The collapse of the gold window in 1971 didn't end the search for stability. In fact, it triggered a frantic global scramble to replace the anchor that had just vanished. But they also feared something new, something Bretton Woods had never anticipated: a world where markets, not metal, determined currency values. Unlike gold, markets could panic, they could rebel, they could turn against a nation's currency in a matter of hours. The question became, how do you stabilize a system that no longer has a center? The United States answered that question not by giving up leadership, but by reinventing it. Unable to back the dollar with gold, it backed it with something else: oil. In 1974, the US reached a series of agreements with Saudi Arabia. The deal was simple on the surface, but profound in consequence. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars. In return, the United States would provide security assistance and support. Over time, the policy spread to other major oil exporters. The world could buy oil only in dollars. And because every nation needed oil, every nation needed dollars. This became the heart of what economists call the petrodollar system. But the real effect went deeper. Countries that earned dollars from selling oil deposited them back into American banks, where they were recycled into loans for developing nations, U.S. government debt, and global financial markets. Dollars flowed out for imports and military spending, then flowed back in as investment. It created a loop the world couldn't easily break. Even if a country wanted to move away from the dollar, doing so risked destabilizing its own currency, its trade, and its access to global markets. This is the point in the story where the cause and effect pattern becomes unmistakable. Bretton Woods unified the global system around the dollar because it was anchored to gold. The end of convertibility unified the system even more tightly because the dollar became anchored to the necessities of modern life. Gold was optional, oil was not. As long as energy was priced in dollars, no rival currency could dethrone it. But the unintended consequences of this new era soon became clear. Dollar-denominated debt surged across the developing world. Banks lent aggressively, often without proper assessment of borrowers' ability to pay. And when global interest rates spiked in the early 1980s, entire regions fell into crisis. Latin America suffered a decade of stagnation, known as the Lost Decade. Africa struggled under crushing debt loads. Even wealthy countries faced turbulence as rising U.S. rates pulled capital out of their economies. These crises weren't accidents, they were symptoms of the system. When the U.S. raised rates to fight inflation at home, the rest of the world paid the price. When global investors panicked and fled to the safety of U.S. Treasury bonds, foreign currencies collapsed, often wiping out savings and triggering political upheaval. The structure that had been built to stabilize global finance now exported volatility across continents. And yet, despite the turmoil, no country could fully detach. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was infrastructure. Attempts to escape the system came in waves. Europe tried to build its own anchor through monetary integration, which eventually produced the euro. But the euro never became a true rival to the dollar because it lacked something fundamental: a unified fiscal authority willing to back it with the same scale and certainty as U.S. treasuries. Without that, the eurozone debt crisis exposed its underlying fragility. Investors ran to dollars during the panic, not away from them. Asia attempted its own path after the 1997 financial crisis. When currency collapses swept through Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and beyond, many governments blamed their vulnerability on reliance on dollar-denominated borrowing. Their solution was to accumulate massive reserves of dollars as self-defense. But this only deepened the system's imbalance. The more reserves they accumulated, the more they reinforced global dollar demand. Even China, with ambitions to internationalize the renminbi, became one of the largest holders of U.S. Treasury debt in the world. Every attempted exit led back to the same place. Even the rise of sovereign wealth funds, regional trade agreements, and currency swap networks has failed to undo the core structure that began in 1944. The reason is as old as Bretton Woods itself. The system was engineered to concentrate stability in one currency. That design remains intact, even if the gold has vanished. To fully understand the trap, we need to examine the psychological and political dimensions, as well as the economic ones. Nations don't stick with the dollar because they like it. They stick with it because the alternatives introduce uncertainty. A new global currency requires trust, coordination, and shared responsibility among countries that often compete with one another. And no government wants to risk destabilizing its export markets or domestic financial system by suddenly shifting the rules. The dollar persists not because the US demands it, but because the world avoids the cost of change. But while the system persists, the strains within it have grown more visible. Consider the modern parallels that show how the old patterns have never gone away. When the 2008 financial crisis erupted, banks failed across the globe. Currencies weakened. Markets froze. And yet, in the middle of the panic, something paradoxical occurred. Demand for US dollars surged. The very country at the center of the crisis became the source of safety. The Federal Reserve opened emergency swap lines with central banks around the world, allowing them to borrow dollars and stabilize their markets. This reinforced a lesson that had been true since the 1970s. When the world panics, it runs toward the dollar, not away from it. The COVID-19 crisis repeated this pattern. As markets crashed in early 2020, the scramble for dollars was so intense that global liquidity evaporated. Once again, the Federal Reserve stepped in, expanding swap lines and providing dollar liquidity to foreign economies. In effect, the central financial institution of the world was not the IMF, not a global reserve currency, and not an international coalition. It was the US Federal Reserve. This dependence isn't just financial, it's structural. Look at global trade. As of recent data, roughly 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. More than half of international loans and nearly all commodities are priced in dollars. Even nations that oppose US policy rely on dollar settlement networks for their exports and reserves. The world hasn't escaped the architecture built at Bretton Woods. It has sunk deeper into it. But the tension is building again. For years, policymakers have warned that the system is becoming unstable. The share of US debt held by foreign nations has grown. The world's central banks have quietly diversified small portions of their reserves into gold, suggesting waning confidence. New blocs, from BRICS to regional alliances, have discussed alternative currencies. Digital payment systems have expanded, raising questions about the future of monetary sovereignty. And the rise of geopolitical competition has made the dollar's dominance both a strategic asset and a potential weapon. These modern challenges echo the flaws embedded in the original Bretton Woods design. Just as the gold link became unsustainable in the 1960s, today the global dollar system shows signs of strain. But the irony is that the more fragile the system becomes, the more the world relies on it. The uncertainty created by geopolitical tension pushes countries toward the safety of US assets. The volatility in emerging markets reinforces the need for dollar reserves, and each crisis strengthens the dollar's grip even further. This is the ultimate trap. The world sees the problems created by dollar dependence, but solving them requires a level of cooperation and coordination that no group of nations has achieved in decades. The structure built at Bretton Woods didn't just concentrate power in one currency. It created a global architecture that resists change. The question is, what happens next? To answer that, we look at the patterns. Every major shift in global monetary systems, the classical gold standard, the interwar period Bretton Woods, and the post-1971 fiat era, followed the same sequence. An anchor is created. It stabilizes the world. It becomes strained by economic growth or geopolitical shifts, and it is replaced by something new. After a crisis forces a rewrite of the rules. Today, we stand at the end of that cycle again. But unlike earlier transitions, there is no obvious successor ready to replace the dollar, no shared vision, no global anchor waiting in the wings. Perhaps the most shocking data point that illustrates the modern dilemma is this. More than 40% of global debt is denominated in dollars, but the United States accounts for only a fraction of global GDP. This imbalance means that decisions made by the Federal Reserve can raise or sink entire economies thousands of miles away. When US rates rise, currencies weaken, capital flees, and dollar debts become harder to repay. When US rates fall, borrowing surges, bubbles inflate, and financial systems become more fragile. The world is tied to the US balance sheet whether it wants to be or not. That imbalance cannot continue indefinitely, but the alternatives still lack the depth, liquidity, and political cohesion to replace the dollar. The euro remains vulnerable to internal fragmentation. China's renminbi is constrained by capital controls and geopolitical suspicion. Gold lacks yield and scalability. Digital currencies face regulatory and technological hurdles. And proposals for a neutral supranational currency resemble Keynes's Bancor, which failed once and would likely fail again for the same reasons. Nations rarely surrender monetary sovereignty willingly, which brings us to the final turn in this story. The unanswered question. If the world knows the system is imbalanced, if the cycles of boom and crisis repeat, and if trust in global institutions is eroding, what breaks the stalemate? History suggests that monetary transitions don't happen gradually. They happen after shocks. Wars reshape power, crises force coordination, defaults rewrite expectations, and somewhere in that turbulence, a new anchor emerges. But no one knows what form the next anchor will take. Perhaps it will be a multipolar system with several major currencies sharing influence. Perhaps it will be a commodity-linked arrangement. Perhaps a digital settlement layer will bypass traditional currency dependence. Or perhaps, as has happened before, the world will cling to the old system longer than anyone expects, not because it works well, but because no one is willing to risk the unknown. Whatever comes next, 3 lessons emerge from the entire arc of the Bretton Woods story. First, monetary systems are political systems. They are built on negotiations, power dynamics, and strategic interests, not purely on economics. Bretton Woods gave the United States control not because it was mathematically superior, but because it was the only country capable of offering stability after a global catastrophe. Every subsequent era has followed the same pattern. The nation with the capacity to project financial stability shapes the rules. Second, global anchors never last forever. The gold standard collapsed under the weight of industrial expansion. Bretton Woods collapsed under the weight of dollar liquidity. The post-1971 fiat order is now showing cracks under the strain of globalization, debt, and geopolitical fragmentation. Systems persist until the pressures exceed their ability to adapt. Third, the search for alternatives always reveals the same truth. Trust, not technology or metal, is the core currency of the world. Keynes knew it. White knew it. Nixon knew it when he closed the gold window. And modern policymakers know it as they navigate a system that depends on confidence in institutions that no longer command universal support. If there is a warning in this story, it's that the next transition may arrive faster than expected. History does not move in straight lines. It moves in breaks, moments when the old rules no longer hold and new ones have not yet emerged. The world today is edging closer to one of those moments. The pressures are rising, the contradictions are sharpening, and the search for a new monetary anchor has begun again, even if no one can yet agree on what it should be. If you want to understand how we got here, why the dollar still dominates, and what the next era of global finance may look like, the first step is simple. Question the assumptions that made the current system seem inevitable. Because nothing in the Bretton Woods order was inevitable. It was a choice made at a moment of crisis, and one day, another crisis will force the world to make a new choice. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing, sharing this video, or diving deeper into the history behind modern money. The system we live in was built long before most of us were born. The one that replaces it may arrive in our lifetime.